Okay, we're ready to start another lesson here to pick up where we left off on Monday with on the screen you can see it says the collapse of Imperial China, which is the main topic for today. That is in your book in chapter 30, section 3. You will notice that we are skipping section 2 for now. That deals with Stalin and totalitarianism, and we will pick up with that next week. So we're skipping it for now, and we're going to pick up with it again later. Before we get too much into China, though, we need to wrap up the effects of the Russian Revolution. You will see on the bottom right here the main ideas. Okay, the main ideas here are the main things that you need to be able to take away from today. You need to know what the effects of the Russian Revolution were. And of course, that's a very complicated and involved, answer. So we're only going to go through some basic effects of the Russian Revolution here today. And then number 2, you see that's the main part of section 3, which is the rise of nationalism and the rise of communism in China. And we'll talk more about that later. But this is when you finish this up and you leave the lesson and you're done, those are the things that kind of it boils down to. Okay, so that's where we're at here. So with that said, let's go. Well, one more thing before we start. Quiz. We were going to take a quiz on 30.1 and 30.3 on Monday of next week. And so you can refer to the book. You can read each section. We've assigned the guided reading, so I expect you to be familiar with this stuff as I go over it today. Look at your terms. Look at rereading the sections and doing those quizzes like you normally would. I will talk about the format of that quiz Friday. So we will talk about that. Then I'll post explanation for how that quiz is going to be going or applied to you. Obviously, it'll be open notes of some sort, but we'll have to talk about that, and I'll save that for later. So, quiz on this and what we did Monday on next Monday. Okay, so now let's get to it. And we'll go back to Russia. Okay, so we talked about the causes of the Russian Revolution, and I went through all of your answers, yesterday, I guess. And what I saw was the vast majority of you put similar answers for the 5 causes of the Russian Revolution. A lot of you put the war as the number one most important factor, the failure of their, especially World War I, but even the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. A lot of you put the autocratic government, the Tsar, and his decision-making, or the failure of his decision-making, as the number one reason. We talked about the reasons of, how the government itself, the secret police, the work camps, the mandatory Russification, all those were factors that you guys put, and I read through those for the most part, and we saw that. And the economic imbalance, right? The wealth of the top fraction of Russian people being so much greater than that of most of the Russian peasantry. All those reasons were causes that culminated with the 1917 revolution. Today we're gonna look at the effects of that revolution, and we're really gonna look at the November revolution, all right, or October in the Russian calendar of the time. Tsar Nicholas abdicates after the February. Remember, there were 2 revolutions, right? The Tsar Nicholas abdicates or gives up his throne in February, and there was a provisional government, you'll remember from the last period we met. The Tsar Nicholas is still alive, and so is his family, all the way through until the November Revolution puts a new government in power, or at least it'll initiate the next move towards a new government, and that's the Bolsheviks. We talked about them before. The Bolshevik Party, of course, being a group of dedicated revolutionaries whose major claim to fame is that they were able to topple the provisional government and seize power. And we'll talk more about how the Bolsheviks are able to accomplish that in a little bit, okay? So we're looking at the major effects chronologically, all right? Number one, the first effect, Tsar Nicholas is out, okay? Starting in February, there is no more Tsar in Russia after hundreds of years of having Tsars, even from the same family, in control of that country. The Tsar is no longer in power. He's not executed right away. That's later on. The Bolsheviks seize power. Talk about how in a second. Once they seize power, they sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which pulls Russia out of World War I. Remember, that was one of the major flaws in the Tsar's plan. And then, again, the provisional government's plan was to continue the war long after the Russian people were ready to be done with it. Okay? So Russia signs the treaty and ends the war. However, and you put yourself in Germany's shoes, right? Germany and Russia are fighting this long, drawn-out war. They've been fighting for 3 years, and the Germans, for the most part, have been winning. And now, all of a sudden, Russia comes to the Germans and says, we want out. We want to finish. We want out. And the Germans are going to demand that the Russians give up tremendous amounts of leverage or money, lands, agreements that are going to be in Germany's favor and not in Russia's favor. Germany has all the cards, and Russia is desperate to get out of the war. Germany knows that, so Germany's going to press that to their advantage. What that means in the end is that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is terrible for Russia in terms of financial liabilities, land given up, and so on to Germany, which angers a significant portion of the Russian people. Okay, so there's several things going on all at once that leads us to our next item, number 4, the Civil War. One of them is this treaty, okay, that was bad for Russia in its terms. Another is the fact that the Bolsheviks had seized power. The Bolsheviks were committed Marxist socialists, okay, and we'll look at Marxism and how it compares to Leninism in just a minute. The Bolsheviks were committed Marxists, and you can imagine not everybody in Russia wanted to move towards a Marxist or socialist model. There are still people that are loyal to the Tsar. There's still a nobility. There's still a small middle class. There are people that disagree fundamentally with socialism that are going to resist the Bolsheviks. There are people that are angry about the treaty, like I said. So there's a lot of different groups of people that are upset with the Bolshevik seizure of power, and they basically were going to group up and rebel against the Bolshevik seizure of power. And this brings Russia straight out of World War I and straight into a civil war between the two sides, in this case being the Reds, which represent the Bolsheviks and the committed Marxists and socialists, and then the Whites, which is a hodgepodge of basically everybody who disagreed with the Bolsheviks. It includes all the groups I've talked about. People that wanted a democracy, people that wanted a capitalist system, people that were religious or committed to the Russian Orthodox Church. It was people that were loyalists to the crown, to the Tsar, and it includes other socialists, actually. Socialist groups that weren't Bolsheviks. There was more than one socialist group going around, and not all of them agreed with the Bolshevik model. So the Whites are going to be a real quilt of different groups of people that are going to be fighting against the Reds, and we'll get into that civil war more in a minute. Ultimately, the Civil War, and I'll get into the details in a minute, but ultimately that war ends with the Reds winning. Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Party, restores order and forms what's called the Soviet Union, which we have all heard of. We'll talk about the new economic policy and what that was. We'll talk about the formation of the Communist Party, and then we will finish with Stalin becoming dictator. Remember, we said Section 2 we're skipping now, so that's why, is because we want to put a bow on the effects of the Russian Revolution, the immediate effects here, and then we'll get into Stalin and his policies when we get into totalitarianism next week. So these are the effects. When we said number one, what were the effects of the revolution? These are the 6 effects, ultimately, and they're in chronological order. Okay? So, a couple things before we move, and I want to get to our first question here before we get too much farther. Compare and contrast Marx and Lenin. All right, so Marx's theory was what the Bolsheviks and Lenin said they based their ideas off of. And I got this chart from page 1749 in your book, okay? So you guys can go back and look at this too on your own iPads or in your book at whenever you want, or if you get stuck. That's where this graphic comes from. But what I want you to do right now is take a look at this chart, and I want you to answer these 2 questions. In what ways were Marx and Lenin similar, and in what ways were they different? All right. So I'll review through your answers to that, and we'll take a look at that later. But in general, I think one thing we can say is true is that what Marx theorized, right? What we talked about in class, right? Marx's theory, and what Lenin did, while obviously Lenin was inspired by Marx, what Lenin actually did and implemented wasn't what Marx had envisioned entirely, right? So Leninism is inspired by Marxism, but is not purely Marxist. And that's one thing we need to take a look at and make sure we're aware of. And we'll talk more about the differences as I look through your answers, and I'll see where we're at on that. Couple things. All right. So we're going to kind of skip through the Russian Civil War. The Russian Civil War is going to be born out of this whole revolution. But before it gets going, I have a couple of words here that we can take a look at and know. One is the word Soviet. Really, this should be lowercase Soviet, right? And when we look at the term, it's not uppercase. It is lowercase Soviet, if I can get that done. And what we'll find out is what I mean by this is that a Soviet is a council. Okay, I have the definition right here for your look right here. Organized by socialist revolutionaries, Soviets were local councils of workers, peasants, and soldiers, and they were organized even while the provisional government was going on. So I say lowercase Soviet because if you lived in a town, there would be a local Soviet, almost like a town council, like in our own cities a little bit. But they would be made up of not the elites, not the landowners. They weren't the factory owners. It wasn't the czars, ministers. It was the local workers, peasants, and soldiers that were on this council or Soviet, okay? And so when you have the provisional government trying to gain power, and then you have a local council of people that you know, it's going to be the local people that you know that you're going to turn to, and you're going to go by their decisions. And so the Soviets were being formed basically from the ground up. And in this way, we could ask the question, in what way were the Soviets similar to Marx's theory? Okay. And I'll put that in a question here for you to look at. Okay, that's the deal. So in what way were the Soviets similar to the Marx theory? All right. What's going to happen to those Soviets over time is that when the Bolsheviks are fought against, the Soviets are natural organizations that are going to funnel support into what the Bolsheviks have going on. Not that the Soviets had to be Bolshevik. Like we said, there were different socialist groups going on at the time, but the Soviets naturally funneled into what the Bolsheviks had going on. One of the first things the Bolsheviks do when they seize power is nationalize farmland. Nationalization means seizure by the government, okay? So if you ever see this term, to nationalize, it means you take the industry that used to be owned by a private individual and you make it the government's property now. And you can nationalize any industry. You can nationalize farmland. So literally all the farms are now owned by the government. You can nationalize the oil industry. You can nationalize manufacturing. You could nationalize baking, and all the bakers in the country now work for the government. That is something that is a staple of communist governments in general. And you see this other term, collectivization. Collectivization means is the process in which the government-owned farmland is now worked by by people in general that are now the farmers are going to share that land and work that land for the government. And that's what it's called. So there's no more private ownership. It's all collectively owned by the group and in reality by the government. Okay, so these are steps that the Soviet Union, or which hasn't been formed yet, the Bolsheviks are going to take through. Okay, we mentioned the Civil War. 14 million people die during the Russian Civil War, which is more than had died in the World War I. So they went straight from World War I with millions of casualties. I think it was something like 2 million casualties on the Eastern Front with their army. And they go straight into a civil war that lasts all the way till 1921. So while the World War I ended at 1918, just a year after the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War goes for 4 more years, all the way into 1921, and 14 million people are killed. So this destroys everything. The entire economy of Russia is destroyed in the Russian Empire. So when the Bolsheviks stand up and they're the last man standing and the war is over, one of the things that they are going to do is they're going to continue their policy of nationalization and state control. And that's what you see here at number 4, is the major industries are all going to be controlled by the state. Okay. Now, you saw the term up here, and I've skipped it until now, new economic policy. What does that actually mean? And this is one of the other effects of the Civil War and the Revolution, is that Lenin is forced to make some hard choices in his balancing his ideology, meaning his Marxist-Leninist teachings as a communist, and the practical reality that Russia's economy is destroyed. And so he institutes what's called a new economic policy, and it's basically capitalism smuggled into a communist government. And it's not pure capitalism, but it's capitalist principles, and at least in small doses. And you can see right here in the definition, peasants are allowed to sell surplus crops, meaning if the government owns the land, the government will tell the peasants how much they are supposed to grow, and they'll have that quota. Okay, it's called a quota. And what you see in this system is that once you reach that quota, and it's a set level, a quota is a set amount, the Lenin told the peasant, okay, you have to grow this many bushels of grain. Let's say it's just for interest of simplicity, they have to grow 10 bushels of grain at their farm, their collective farm. Anything that they grow above the 10 bushels, they get to sell themselves, meaning they don't have to give it to the government. They sell it on the open market, and they can make all that money directly for them. It motivates them to grow beyond their quota, because they know that if they go beyond the quota, they will get paid for it directly, and it's money in their pocket. Same thing for some small businesses and so on. Basically, while there's still major industries are still run by the government, the banks are still controlled by the government, some of the smaller businesses and farms still did operate under these policies, and it actually worked. All right, by 1928, 7 years after the war was over, they finally got their economy back on track to kind of where it had been. Of course, remember, the Russian economy was already bad even before the war started, so meaning World War I. So getting back to where they started wasn't necessarily a good thing, in terms of the global scale. But more on that later and how that's going to play out. Okay, so all we're going through here is kind of the main bullets of the transition from Civil War into the formation of really the Soviet Union at this point with the Red victory. Okay? And that's where we see here, right? This is where we're picking up. Soviet Union is formed, and what we see here is the emergence of the Bolsheviks into what becomes the Communist Party of Russia. Okay, so remember, the Bolsheviks were revolutionaries. They were a small group. They organized and led the revolution, and it's not that just the Bolsheviks were fighting. There were workers and peasants that rose up with them. Okay, but the Bolsheviks were the leaders of all of this. Okay, and in the Marxist model, the revolution was supposed to be led by the proletariat, which was the working class entirely. And we saw that in our question earlier in the chart. But in this case, it really wasn't the proletariat that led the revolution. It was a small group of people, the Bolsheviks themselves. And so when the revolution is over, the Marxist ideal would be that the proletariat would seize power and rule until there was an equitable distribution of property and the other factors of production, and eventually the government would disappear. That's not what happens here, and we saw that earlier. The Bolsheviks renamed themselves the Communist Party. Instead of a dictatorship of the proletariat, they become a dictatorship of the party, and with Lenin at its head. Okay, so that's what I said here compared to Marx. Is this what's happening? Is what's happening here what Marx envisioned in the 1850s? Okay, remember, Marx just wrote a book. He was writing a book, a theory, and this is something that's actually happening. So there's a disconnect there, and we got to look at that and talk more about it. Lenin gets shot. A woman shoots him and attempts to assassinate him. The assassination fails. Lenin lives. They capture the woman, and she is executed, but it destroys Lenin's health, and eventually he has a stroke and dies. And Stalin will become his successor, and like I said, we'll deal with that next week. Okay, so that's all for the Soviet Union, and we're going to have to cut the rest of this pretty short, and I'll try to race through the rest. Here's the Soviet Union. Okay. And you can see it's just the Russian Empire repackaged into different Soviet socialist republics. Okay, so each of these are now independent countries, but they were each a Soviet republic, with Russia being the dominant one. But you see each of these were Soviet republics during its day. Okay, so the collapse of Imperial China. We're going to keep this short because we only had about 9 minutes left before I'm going to shut this down. Okay, because we're trying to keep this at 30. Remember, rise of nationalism in China, rise of communism in China. So you can look at all of these things here on this slide as reasons why nationalism rose in China. And these are all things we've talked about already. So I'm not going to spend more time, and this is where I can kind of go faster through this, okay? The Taiping Rebellion, which 1850, 1864, 20 million deaths, one of the most destructive, or if not the most destructive civil conflict in the history of the world, which went through the Opium Wars, the spheres of influence that the Europeans and Japan had, the Boxer Rebellion. You remember all this from our imperialism packet that we did at the beginning of this whole distance learning thing, okay? So those are reasons why nationalism would rise in China. Nationalism just means that there are groups of Chinese that say all of this needs to be over, and we need to create a modern, independent China, rather, without the influence of other countries, okay? So there are questions and answers the Chinese need to come up with. And some of the earlier questions are going to be, should they modernize the military and industry or rely on tradition? Well, very early on, the rely on tradition officials who delayed the modernization of China, that answer will be gone, okay? In the end, it's going to be modernize the industry and military, but the way that is going to happen is number two, okay? So how are we going to modernize our military, our industry, our economy, our society? Are we going to westernize, which means become like Western civilization, adopt Western values and like democracy, and individual freedom, or the rise of communism? And we'll see the rise of the end of the Imperial China. Last emperor abdicates in 1911, so China becomes a republic all right, in 1911. And only 10 years later, the Russian Revolution ends and you see the beginning of the Soviet Union. So all of a sudden, this is a period of time where communism looks like it's a very good idea or alternative for countries looking to go in a new direction, which China certainly is at this time, okay? Some basics, okay? Rise of nationalism. We can't do the rise of nationalism without these two terms. Sun Yat-sen, which is the leader of the Chinese nationalists, the first leader of them, and the Kuomintang, which is the Chinese Nationalist Party. It's a political group that comes to rule the new Chinese Republic, and this is their flag, okay? The three principles of Sun Yat-sen and his nationalists are, of course, nationalism, right? We don't want foreigners in our country calling the shots anymore. Democracy, all right? He wants the people to have a voice in their new government, and economic security. He wants to build up industry in what has mostly been a peasant society, which China had been and continued to be even at this point. So these are the basics of what the nationalist group wanted to be, okay? However, the nationalist government suffered from severe weaknesses during the teens and 20s, all right? And the weaknesses are summarized here, okay? Warlordism. Basically, the central government collapses into various different warlords that were seizing power. Basically, the book says each general would carve out as much of China as their army could hold, and they would just rule it arbitrarily in their area. Remember, the emperor had been in control of China since prehistoric times almost, right? Since anybody could ever remember. So this is an unprecedented time for China, although it is very similar, I guess, in some ways to the various collapses of other dynasties in the past. The difference is that instead of replacing one dynasty with another dynasty, but still being an imperial system, an empire, now it's being replaced by social change. And that's where the Civil War comes in here, is are we going to be democratic and Western, or are we going to go to communism, which is a significant shift from the dynastic cycle, and that's why we usually say it's the end of the dynastic cycle. Warlordism, so we got that, right? Disillusionment with Western democracies. So China joins the Allies during World War I, hoping to get land and money out of it from when the Allies win. However, most of the territories in Asia that had been settled by Germany or controlled by Germany were given to Japan instead. So China not only didn't get anything out of the war, the prize went to their rival Japan instead. This upsets China, and it's just another disillusionment, right? Break from what the Western democracies were doing. The May the 4th movement was started by Chinese students. Basically, this is a protest of the Western decision of Western influence in their society. Ultimately, this is something that's going to fuel the rise of communism in China. The movement of the Chinese people's loyalty or interest away from the Western democracies and towards communism, okay? And so what we see here is ultimately Sun Yat-sen himself turned to Lenin for military and economic support. So at this point, this is still the Kuomintang, right? The Communist Party in China is going to be born out of the Kuomintang. So when we say the rise of nationalism, the communists were nationalists too, in the sense that they were part of this movement to get rid of foreign influence in China. But at this point, we're going to start to see a split where the Chinese Communist Party is going to identify itself more strongly and have a self-identity that will be separate from the rest of the nationalists, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The leader of the Chinese Communist Party, one of the founders of this party, will be Mao. Okay, and we'll talk a lot about him as we move forward. One important thing that he does, and the Chinese communists did really well, is they focused on the peasantry rather than the workers, rather than the cities and the workers. Remember, most of China is not industrialized at all, and so that means that virtually all Chinese people are peasants, okay? And he's appealing to them. Okay, so we said that the Chinese communists were born out of the Kuomintang, but they're going to have a separate identity very soon. And this is going to culminate with the Sun Yat-sen dies, and the new leader of the Chinese nationalists is going to be Jiang Jiechi, or sometimes called Chiang Kai-shek. He hates the communists. He's supported by the middle class, bankers, business people. These are people that have the most to lose if the Chinese government becomes communist. And so they are going to be anti-communist for sure. So Chiang decides to take on the Communist Party before it grows any stronger, and he orders his men to kill the communists that he finds. And most of the time they were focused in southern China at the time. Shanghai was the city where the event occurred. They murdered or killed many of the communists in Shanghai, and that was the cub of communism at the time, where Mao was and his people. And so they almost win. They almost totally destroy the Communist Party in this basically just a hit, like a ordered assassination from the government against these people that were part of the Chinese system. Anyway, the communists then revolt, and there's a civil war. The civil war is, and I'll finish with that. I'm not going to read all these things to you. I'll ask a question and post it there, and you can take a look at it. But in general, just take a look at who is supporting who, what are the goals, strengths, and weaknesses of the two. The problem with all of this is that the Civil War is going to be put on hold in the early 1930s. In 1933, this conflict between the two groups is going to be ended by the invasion of China by Japan, and we'll get in. We're getting really close to the beginning of World War II. Okay, and from China's point of view, World War II might as well have started in 1933 with the invasion with the invasion from Japan. So more on that later, and I'll post a question below, and we'll go from there. Okay. So I hope you guys have a great weekend, and we will have this quiz on Monday. I'll post more about that tomorrow. Okay. Have a great day. See ya.